Awesome. We're a privately owned firm. We've got about 240 plus staff. We've in the top corner there, you can see we've got offices across Ontario. We're focused in Ontario. We are a full life cycle engineering firm, so we do traditional engineering design and all that. But as you can see on my third bullet there, we've got a very large team that focuses on asset management and infrastructure planning. So we're over 70. We've done a lot of projects. Just the background, GM is Gamsey Manuel. It's an engineering firm that's been around for over 50 years. And BluePlan was focused on, was a startup firm in 2011, 2012. And we merged in 2014. So I've been doing this kind of stuff for over 30 years and looking forward to sharing some of the experience. Thanks. Go ahead, Shelley.
Well, hi, everyone. Apologies for the camera not working for some reason, but my name is Shelley Hazen, and I'm a climate change specialist with GEI Consultants in the Savanta division in Ontario. GEI is an employee-owned environmental consulting and engineering firm. So we have around 900 staff in 45 offices across North America, and a really diverse range of clients, including public and private sector, Indigenous communities and organizations, and all levels of government across Canada and the US.
Right, thanks, Shelley. So I'm going to go over the first part, and then Shelley will just the overall framework of that we are applying the project, and then Shelley's going to talk about phase one. All in all, like the presentations leading to today were great. They were a great lead up actually for our presentation, right? We heard things about what's happening in our environment and where we're seeing the industry go. We heard just before this about some of the legal implications and what municipalities are on the hook for. And that actually does lead itself really well into what drove the development of this framework. At the bottom there's a line, and really it was a lot of our clients were coming to us and saying, we know you guys are doing some great asset management work, but we need something to deal with climate change. We're hearing from our counselors, what are we doing? What can we do? And there really wasn't something around climate change adaptation that was out there. So we looked at what we were doing from an asset management perspective and said, how do we develop a framework that gives an approach to review these events, the impacts of these events on assets, on level of service and customers, and come up with some repeatable way to deal with this that municipalities could follow. And that's really what drove the development of the framework and the project that we started here. You want to go next slide, Shelley, please? So the framework, I have the three circles over here. We use this a lot when we talk about enterprise asset management, any of this stuff. Really, for this to be successful, you got to think about. We always think about the strategies and the frameworks, and the ideas have to overlap with the operations and maintenance folks and the asset management, or what we call the decision support. This is more of a system-based image, but those three circles there really are just talking to. We wanted a framework that would overlap across all of the ideas so that you could have complete closure on the approach. So what we did was we looked at it and we developed a three-stage approach. I'm going to talk about the three stages very quickly, and then again, Shelley's going to go through the results from phase one in detail. But really what we said was the first thing we need to do is we need to understand what are the events that impact our systems and our customers, and what's the probability of these events happening. So that's phase one, is really around that probability analysis. Once that is complete, phase two really starts to overlap those events on assets and systems and customers, and say what's our risks, what are we exposed to, and how do we think we want to approach dealing with that or adapting to those risks. And then phase three is about actually getting into the strategies. And there are strategies that involve asset management, there are strategies that involve other areas, and I'll talk a little bit about that. Go ahead, Shelley. Thank you. So the objectives really of everything, of the framework, of the project, what we were trying to accomplish with this initiative was really, we kept hearing there isn't a link between asset management and climate change. And we've started to see that. We've started to build that into some of our projects. So for example, we will do an asset management or a plan for a wastewater system, a linear system. And, we have to apply different storm events onto the hydraulic models to figure out what kind of protection do we have. And a lot of times, we're looking at storm events and the numbers are based on historic, what a 1 in 50 or a 1 in 25 year used to mean. And that's something that all municipalities are struggling with. Obviously, you're seeing these events are becoming much more frequent. So what does a 1 in 50 year event really look like now? What does those numbers look like? So a lot of our projects, we're starting to actually show, different event sizes and the level of risk that's being dealt with from the capital plans moving forward. So we're starting to see that a lot, but we weren't really seeing an overall framework. So we wanted to develop a better connection between the two. We wanted to make sure that what we were doing was really, if you're going to make decisions, it's got to see impacts on level of service and costs, because that's really what councillors, want to make decisions on. And in developing the framework and then this project, we really wanted to go through and calibrate and test the framework through the project and make sure that it's working, so that not only the participants of the project right now, but other clients can take that and run with it. And part of what we're going to do is we are testing the project for 2 very specific asset classes, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. Go ahead, Shelley. So so who got involved? We had some great conversations with 6 or 7 municipalities in the GTA, and the following 5, just going from left to right, with Hamilton, Halton, Peel, Toronto, and Durham have all stepped up to participate in the pilot, which kicked off about 4 or 5 months ago. Okay, so we're all working together through this. Keep going, Shelley. I'm trying to go quickly through some of these just so we don't run out of time. So phase 1, I won't spend a lot of time because Shelley's going to go into detail. But again, what we were trying to do was really working with our clients. We wanted to go through and say, okay, the pilot is focused. I should mention the pilot is focused on water and wastewater infrastructure only. We recognize in order, how much could we tackle for the amount of work and the budget we had, and we really wanted to focus it on a group of assets so we could be specific. We went through and we had workshops with operations and maintenance folks from the 5 municipalities, and it was really a great exercise in terms of identifying items and events that meant something. One of the things I hadn't thought about was a huge event for some of the municipalities was getting any kind of rain, even a small rainfall event, after a number of cold days where the ground is still frozen, so there's no absorption, and they ended up seeing higher overflow rates than some of the large summer events. So that was something that we looked at. Probably wouldn't have thought about if we hadn't gone through the exercise of reviewing this with the client. So we went through. I'll leave phase 1, but essentially it was a review of the probability, identifying events and reviewing the probability of those events happening in the 30s, the 50s, and the 80s. Which then fed into the next slide, which is really our phase 2 approach. And our phase 2 approach, once we had those events, we had the probability of those events, we wanted to apply the events on the assets, on the systems, and really start to understand what were the impacts these events have on customers, on the actual customers that are receiving the service, right? One of the examples I'm going to talk a little bit about is we saw some extreme cold that we hadn't seen for a while a few years ago, and over the last quite few years. And remember, we started seeing in Toronto, residents will remember this. I think some Peel residents experienced that, but the frost line went down to 6 feet, and they started seeing a whole bunch of frozen water services. So customers suddenly have no water, and the city had to deal with that. Those are the kind of things that we want to look at and say, okay, if that's an event, and based on depending on the probability of that event happening, there's different approaches. At the 3 approaches you see there, the 1, 2, 3. The last approach, which is what we tend to have to do when these things happen, is we have to respond. So for things that have low probability or very expensive, as a municipality, you may have to just accept the fact that we're never going to build resiliency to that. We're just going to have to respond. So developing an emergency response or an operational response or procedure is all we can do. In some cases, we may say, we can deal with those things. We see things where there's events where we see flooding in pump stations, for example, during very high precipitation events, and lower areas of a pump gallery or something may flood over, and that's where you may see, we can deal with that. We can replace some of the assets, either move them above the flood line or replace some of these assets that are going to be underwater with waterproof equipment. And those might be things that we say, probability is not great there, but as we do design, as we upgrade that facility or that asset, we've updated our design specs so that those things will be put in gradually as we get there. And 1 and 2, the asset management strategies and the design modifications, they're very similar in terms of you're going to look to replace or change systems and assets to mitigate against the risk of that event. I think the difference really is when it's in asset management, you're putting that lens into your decision support systems, into the way you make decisions on your capital program, and you're going to replace things much more aggressively and quicker versus I think things that have a lower probability or maybe are too expensive, you may say, you know what, we know this is the way to go, but we're going to just update our design specs. So then we won't touch those things until we're actually updating the facility or the asset, because there's a lower cost, which means it'll be pushed off later on. So really, phase two was about reviewing all of the events against those assets and against the impact of the customers, and assigning one of these three strategies. And at the end of phase two, what we really want to do is have every impact gets assigned a 1, a 2, or a 3, so that the municipality has an approach on how they're going to deal with that their adaptation strategy. If you go to the next slide there, Shelley, I think I have an example here. So the frozen well example, I'll keep talking a little bit about, but basically, it can be dealt with any three of the responses, right? We could just say from the bottom there, we could say, look, we don't have the cost, we don't have the time right now to deal with this. So we're going to respond to complaints. We're going to go out there and we're going to deal with them as they happen. And that's going to be our emergency response. And with that comes, there's lower capital dollars. You can see they're here, obviously, but your operating costs will go up. And your impacted customers can go up or down depending on how you do that. Because if you're just waiting for it to happen, obviously you're going to have more impacted customers. The next level up would be the design modification. And I think most municipalities have done this now, is updated their specs to say all laterals need to be installed less than 6 feet deep. That way, if we get that extreme cold, they're below the frost line, we don't have to worry about it. And those will be replaced as those water mains are being replaced through the system based on the natural capital program. So areas where water mains that may have that, they may not get replaced for 25 years if that pipe is not slotted to be replaced. Versus if you're going to be aggressive, you say there's a big problem, the probability is high enough, we're going to put it in the program. Maybe over the next 5 years, we're going to target all those laterals and we're going to proactively go out and replace them. And in those cases, your capital dollar is going to go way up, but what you're going to see is your impacted customers are going to go down and down and down year by year as you change out those assets. So what we did in phase two, if you go to the next slide, Shelley, is we actually went through, you can see here, it's a little complicated, and I know it's small, so it's not meant to read through everything, but what we have along the top is we have our events along the top. We've got extreme precipitation, and in this case, we looked at about 6 or 7 different events intensities. And then left here in the blue, you can see here all our asset classes. So we reviewed you guys are going to see my daughter is crawling in the corner there to get us something from the printer. I apologize, I got someone in grade 1 who's been running around the house. But what we did was we looked on the left at the assets against the events, and we started in workshops with stakeholders at every level: operations, engineering, climate change. We went through and we started to brainstorm what are the events and how does that impact the assets and the customers. And we started to identify their current responses. In this case, the top one is a 3 and a 3 emergency response. We went through and we identified how they were trying to address those responses. And at the end of phase two, really what we have now is we have these workshops, we have all the events, and we have all the targeted approaches on how they want to move forward with adapting to those. I know it sounds simple, like this is just the first or second step. The third step is the really big step behind this. Shelley, if you move to the next slide. And this is really where you got to come down. The third, phase 3 is where our clients and GM BluePlan and Savanta and GAI, we're going to start getting into the meat of things, actually building those strategies. As part of our pilot, we reviewed all of the events that impact water and wastewater for phase 1. We reviewed those events against all water and wastewater assets as part of phase 2. Phase 3 scope had to be smaller. What we're really doing is we're going to target 2 asset classes. So 1 water, 1 wastewater, likely 1 linear and 1 vertical asset class. And what we want to do for phase 3 is we want to take those assets and run them through an asset management process. We want to look, you can see the blue box at the bottom there. We want to apply a climate change adaptation lens on those 2 asset classes so we can see the impacts that climate change has. So we'll run it before where we don't change anything. What's your current capital program look like? Look at the risks, look at the probability of those risks and say, okay, what's your current capital budget? It's not going to change, but we can look and see based on those climate events and those risks, how many customers do we think are going to be impacted? And what is the operating response going to look like to deal with that? So we can see operating costs, we can see impacted customers, and we see the old capital cost. Now we're going to put that climate change lens on top of that, and we're going to rerun the asset management, the decision support system. And what are we going to see? We're going to see the capital costs go up. Going back to my water lateral example, we're going to replace a whole bunch of laterals over the next 5 years. So what we're going to see is we're going to see capital costs go up. But what we're also going to see is the number of customers being impacted going down. We're going to see operating costs going down. And what we really want to try and see is if we apply that climate change lens in our asset management world, what is that cost versus impacted customers from the capital and operating costs versus the customers? And does it make sense? Really, it's a model for the municipalities to go through and say, okay, now we know the cost. Can we afford this? You know, going back to that the slide, the presentation before us, we talked about the liability to the municipality. Well, if you don't have the information to make the decisions, you can't really gauge that liability. This model will allow them to assess those costs, impacted customers, and then go back and say, okay, well, you know what, we can adapt to this event, but it may involve a 20 or 30 or 50% increase to the property taxes. Is that something we're willing to deal with? We won't know until we have the facts. And really, that's what this framework is about. Thanks. I think I've talked enough here. I'm going to turn it over to Shelley. Thanks, Shelley.
Thanks, Terry. Well, my video's on now, so I'm not just a talking blank screen, which is great. So I'm going to walk you through our phase 1 methodology now. So Terry gave a brief overview of the approach a few slides back, but I'm just going to sort of dig into the details. So in phase 1, it was all about understanding and determining climate change events of interest or concern to municipal assets for our 5 participants. So we started by doing a bit of digging and obtaining any previously completed climate trend studies or reports that had been completed for the municipalities within, say, the past 5 years or so. So any existing climate trends reports or PIVC reports where we might be able to leverage some of that climate data, that was our first stop along this process. And then through a survey and a joint workshop, we began to identify single climate events or variables of interest, as well as combination events and back-to-back variables that we wanted to bring forward for more of a detailed analysis. Our next step was then to obtain all of this climate data for the variables we were choosing from the Government of Canada and Ontario climate portals that you've probably heard of, climate.ca. And then we cross-reference our finding with any of those existing climate trends from step 1 of this. So our climate scientists then took all of this data and did some modeling and began estimating the historical and future probabilities for the chosen climate events that we wanted to run through. And each of these climate event probabilities was then assigned what we were calling a qualitative confidence level. And there's going to be more details on that in the coming slides. I'll sort of unpack that a little bit. And when we look at climate data, we really want to make sure this is part of our role, that we're properly communicating to our clients. We want them to understand and be able to use this data. So part of the reason why we expressed all of this complex projections as probability is that it tends to make a bit more sense to engineering staff or infrastructure managers. It's a little more tangible than just talking about changes in measurements, say an increase of 10 millimeters in precipitation. That can be a bit hard to picture how that's going to impact assets. But if you hear, there's an X% likelihood of a given event that these municipalities may have already experienced, so they know what that event looks like. There's an X% that it's going to happen in this time frame. That's way easier and resonates with a lot more people. So that's why we chose to go with probability. So some climate event data and parameters are widely available online in free portals, while others are not. So the climate parameters that are typically freely available, that's things like your temperature, total precip, extreme heat and cold, and even growing conditions. But many of the important climate events or those customized thresholds, like the back-to-back example that Terry talked about, or even hourly events or those complex parameters, they require a bit more expertise to sort of derive or some level of post-processing, which was what we did for some of these events that we brought forward. So our approach really allowed for this customization of really relevant climate events for the municipalities. And we tailored our approach to also then cross-reference any of that existing data that we ran. And the joint workshop and survey really allowed us to have these deep and detailed discussions with the municipalities to talk about those tailored events. So, as an example piece Peel said they've run into issues where you have 3 consecutive days where the temperature is less than 10 degrees Celsius, followed by a rise to 0 degrees in the day. So that's a quick melt where, you know, the ground might still be frozen, and that caused issues. So it's these type of events that you might not think about off the top of your head that we then thought, let's bring those forward. And those need some post-processing, more of that customization in the data. Now, one question that we often get asked when we're talking about climate modeling is, can you tell me if we're going to have another July 8th storm, when we're going to have it, what year we're going to have it? And the answer is no. So climate models cannot predict with certainty whether extreme surgical rainfall events like this will happen or on what date. But what they can provide is an understanding of how extreme rainfall events may change over time, the probability of the occurrence of this type of event happening. And then this gives us a better understanding of what we need to do to prepare for these types of high intensity rainfall events. Now, if you think about these 5 municipalities, you think about the geographic area, it's a really big area. You think of something like Durham, it's you know, it goes kilometers and kilometers, spans north to south. So in order to sort of capture any potential spatial differences in the climate trends within the municipalities, we obtained 2 sets of climate projections from a northern and a southern grid cell within each of the municipalities. So these grid cells cover an area of approximately 10 kilometers square, and you'll see the coordinates on this slide if anyone's interested in the exact locations. And so we expected that the probability of climate events would be different across the municipalities, and this is just due to geographic variability and local influences. And by that I mean things like topography and lake-based influences and effects and shorelines and other variables that we know that each one of these municipalities has their own unique characteristics. So we would expect to see slightly different results for our projections. It's expected, and that is what we saw. So generally speaking, climate uncertainty increases the further we go out in time. So if you consider this figure, this displays the latest climate scenarios. This is the representative concentration pathways, or RCPs, over time. And clearly you're seeing that the range in projections increases the more we model out to the future based on increasing uncertainty. And this is uncertainty in human planning and actions and climate feedback cycles and other areas of active research. So one way that we reflected this increasing uncertainty range is by providing the 10th and 90th percentile range in climate projections across our ensemble data. And an ensemble is simply a group of model runs. So by looking at more than just 1 or 2 models, and in our case, we looked at 16, we could look at minimums, maximums, and then this ensemble average of all the data. And I mentioned in the overview of the methodology that we'd be assigning confidence ratings, qualitative confidence ratings to each of our climate events. So these qualitative rankings, they factor in things such as these model biases. And the data sources and the frequency analysis assumptions, all of this was documented in technical reports. So we essentially read this kind of like a traffic light. It's a green, a yellow, a red. So if you see a green, this means green means go. It's robust data. There should be no concern with using these numbers. We're highly confident in these numbers. Yellow means, you know, you're going to slow down, proceed with caution a little bit. There may be some data limitations to consider. So you have to consider if you're willing to take those limitations and risks. Red means you're going to want to use these numbers with caution, or you're going to include caveats in the products based upon them in saying that significant data gaps may exist or significant assumptions were required to develop these results. And that's just how climate modeling works, especially if you're looking at combination events. So this slide just gives you a snapshot, although a hard to read one, you know, we're not looking at in detail of all these numbers here, of what we call the probability matrix that we put together for each of the municipalities. So each one of these, we produced a matrix with their customized data. And we did projections for the 3 standard time horizons, the 2030s, 50s, and 80s, which takes us out to the end of the century. So if you look in gray, this is our historical condition. We included the annual occurrence. This was events per year, the probability of occurrence in 1 year, and the return period historically. Our projected conditions, we also looked at the annual occurrence, the 10th and 90th percentile range, the probability of occurrence in a year, and a return period. And you'll also see, although it's a little bit hard, we've included what was called a trend visualization. So for each one of our events, we provided a visual representation of how that climate event was trending. Are we seeing an increase? Are we seeing a decrease? Is it sort of stagnant? Is it flat? It's just another way to express all of this information. We wanted to give the municipalities multiple ways of interpreting and expressing this data so that it could make sense to multiple different people who are going to be using it. And again, we've applied this confidence rating, and that's why you're seeing all these colors, the red, yellow, and green. And in total, we looked at actually about 30 unique climate events that were customized for each of the municipalities. And this is just a very quick snapshot of the climate events that we ran. And it doesn't include all of these specific thresholds in there. That was in a different column. So they were categorized as our water events, so your precipitation events, temperature related, there's single, there's back-to-back combination events, and then other customized events as well. So there was a very big matrix with tons of data that the municipalities can then use across all of their assets. So I just wanted to zoom in on the findings because I know that first matrix was a bit hard to see. Just to give you a quick example of what we did for Peel. So this was for a less extreme precipitation event, and it was days where precipitation was greater than 20 millimeters. So not too extreme. And I'm not walking through every number here. I just wanted to sort of zoom in and highlight. So in the gray, you'll see the historical condition. You'll notice that trend line I was talking about. So you'll see that trend. We're seeing an increase in this event. The green is our short term, the 2030 projections. You may notice that the confidence rating has now gone from a high or a green to a yellow or a medium, as well as out to the 2050s and 2080s. So you're seeing that shift in confidence as we're projecting out. Yellow is our mid-century and red is our long-term. So all of this information is for every single one of those climate events if you zoomed in on those matrix tables. Now, each of the municipalities received a technical report after detailing our methodology, all of this climate data, and we graphed just a couple of the events just to help them sort of visualize or show them how they could graph all of this to share their results. So just two examples here. On the left, again, this is for region of Peel. This would be receiving 100 millimeters of precipitation or more in 3 days. And as you'll see, it's rising. And this is represented by the ensemble average, which is indicated by the solid blue line. And that uncertainty that I talked about, that 10th and 90th percentile, that's represented in that blue shaded area there. So same with the graph on the right. This is displaying results for, we called it climate event number 22. And this was a customized event where Peel was experiencing 5 consecutive days with temperatures less than -15, followed by that rise to about -2. So this trend you're seeing is characterized by a decrease. We're seeing this type of event actually decreasing, as represented again by that thick blue ensemble average. And again, we're having that uncertainty range shown in the light blue. So the second graph gives you that idea of that combination event that was highly customized to Peel, because historically an event like this had caused problem for them for their water and wastewater. So they identified it as a certain threshold that we were going to carry through all of this climate modeling and projections. I think I pass it back over to you now, Terry.
Okay, thanks. This is really our last slide. So basically where we're going to from here. So we've completed phase 2 where we've gone through and all the participants have reviewed the phase 1 results. We've had our workshops. We've assigned an approach to all of the events against the assets, which is being delivered on Wednesday this week, actually, through a workshop. And we are now going through the process of selecting the 2 asset classes, and we'll be jumping into the analysis, which is being driven by our April date for this workshop. So we'll be coming back. We've got all the phase 2 results to present. We want to have some of the phase 3 results ready to go, and then basically from there we will we'll look back with all the stakeholders and refine the framework to make sure that they can run with it. Again, we're only going to apply it in detail on 2 asset classes in phase 3, but they'll be able to run with it and go on their own for the remainder of the water wastewater assets and take the same framework and apply it across the board.